Hello, and welcome to IC&D 1, Lab 1, titled Navigating a Router Switch Command Line Interface. If you're using the CCNA exam certification guides from Cisco Press, the best time to do this particular lab is after reading IC&D 1 books Chapter 8 or Chapter 13. Like all labs in this product, this lab begins with a list of objectives, followed by some scenario steps. In this particular lab, by the time you're done, you should be better able to use iOS command line interface help features and describe the differences between user mode, enable mode, and configuration mode. You'll also be able to describe the differences between exec commands and config commands, and also move around between user mode, enable mode, and configuration mode. The scenario for this lab has two main steps. In the first step, you'll see a user getting in through the console into user mode and using command line interface help features to get help and use some basic commands. In the second step, you'll see that same user move from user mode to enable mode into configuration mode and navigate between the three modes and see some examples of different commands you can use in each mode. The network used here in Lab 1 looks like the picture you see there. 3 routers, 4 switches with some serial links between the routers. However, for our purposes, the only one that matters is router 1. We're going to have a PC that's connected via the console cable you see there into router 1, and we're just going to use the command line interface on router 1. So let's go ahead and begin step 1. To reach user mode in a router, the user must either connect to the router through the console, or through an auxiliary port, or by telnetting into the router. Any of these 3 methods let the user reach user mode, so it's the first mode that a user sees on the command line interface on a router. From user mode, the user can type any harmless exec commands. First of all, they're harmless because you can't hurt the router, and they're called exec commands because the router takes the command and, quote, executes the command and spits back some command output to you. You know you're in user mode when you look at the command prompt and see a greater than sign. Before we see the command line interface, a couple of key points to take note of. First of all, anytime you need to get help, simply type the question mark, and that's likely a good place for which the router will give you some output that gives you some hints about what to do next. Also, you have some commands that have a lot of output. In fact, so much output it doesn't fit on one page. So when that happens, the router will put the word more at the bottom of the text. And then if you hit the space bar, iOS will give you several more lines, or if you hit the enter key, it'll give you one more line. And we'll see an example of that coming up. Additionally, when you're tired of seeing the output of a particular command, if you press any key other than the enter key or space bar, iOS terminates the command. Next, let's take a look at the command line interface on a router. Here I'll be using a terminal emulator called TerraTerm. If you see the Help About TerraTerm window here, notice there's a website listed, www.ayera.com. If you go to that website, you can download a freeware version of the terminal emulator that I'm using to build these labs. Now, every terminal emulator has some serial settings that need to match the router or switch console port. Now, if you look at the serial settings for this particular emulator, it matches the router's default settings, which is to use 9600 bits per second, 8 bits of ASCII data, no parity, 1 stop bit, and no flow control. So this emulator is set up and ready to go. Now notice the screen is blank at this point. The router's waiting on me to do something. So if I press the enter key, notice I'll get a password prompt. Now this password prompt expects me to type in the console password. You can configure a password that's required of the user when they connect via the console, and that's been pre-configured. So I type in the password. Of course, the letters don't show up so that nobody can look over your shoulder and see the password. And now you're in user mode. Notice the prompt ends in a greater than sign, which means that you're in user mode, and the R1 part of the prompt simply lists the host name that's been pre-configured on this router. When in doubt, you can always press the question mark to get help. For instance, here, I just pressed the question mark. I didn't need to press the enter key afterwards. And after pressing the question mark, I got several lines of help. On the left, I see a list of commands, and on the right, I see a short explanation of the commands. Also notice near the bottom of the screen, there's the word more. That means the command has more output to tell me. If I press the enter key, I get one line at a time. So I press the enter key once here, now another time, and now another time, each time seeing one additional line of output. If I want to see a bunch more lines, I simply press the space bar, and we see a lot more lines of output. Now in this case, the help is finished, and it's waiting on me to type a command. So let's just say I typed the show interfaces command. Now once I type that and press enter, I get several lines of output, and once again I see a more at the bottom of the screen. So I could press the space bar to get several more lines of output, the enter key to get one line, or I can press any other key besides the space bar or the enter key to terminate the command output. You can also get help for command parameters. For instance, you just saw the help that you get when you do a show space question mark, and you may have noticed the IP option. Now let's say you did show space IP, but you didn't know any of the options that followed that. Well, as you see here, if you do a show space IP space question mark, you get all the options that follow the parameter IP. So you could do that to get the different parameters. Notice there are a lot of options on the show IP command, so you see more at the bottom of the screen. So as usual, you can hit the space bar to get lots more lines, the enter key to get a single line, or any other character to terminate the command. Next, let's look at a different way to use the question mark. Notice I've typed show space IP space R, and now if I press a question mark without a space, what the router thinks is, oh, you want help about parameters for this command that start with R. Notice it lists 6 different words there, including the word route. So let's just say I was looking for the command show IP route. I could do show IP R question, see the route option, and be reminded that route is one of the options. Now before we go, there's another quick usability thing that's very useful for learning. Let's just say I typed show IP RO, and I think that that command is unique. Meaning that if I typed the enter key right now, that the router should say, oh, RO is a valid abbreviation for the word route. Now I could do that, and notice it is a valid abbreviation. But if I didn't remember, and I hit the tab key as I'm about to do now, notice that the router said, oh, RO is a valid abbreviation. Let me hit the tab key, and it spells out the rest of the command. So it gives you a way to confirm your thinking that, all right, that is a valid abbreviation for a command. Next, let's move on to step 2. In step 2, we'll examine the 3 most important modes of the iOS command line interface, namely user mode, enable mode, and configuration mode. These modes allow the users to use different commands and do different things, so it's important that you move to the correct mode before you do the command that you need to do. Now to move between modes, you start out in user mode as we've talked about before, then to get into enable mode, you use the enable command. After using that command, the router typically prompts you for a password. When you type in the correct password, you're in enable mode and can do some different commands. Now if you're tired of using enable mode, you can use the disable command to move from enable mode back to user mode. Quite frankly, most people don't bother, but you probably ought to know that for the test. Now if you decide later you want to configure the router, tell it some new configuration parameter that tells the router how to operate, you can use the configure command while in enable mode and move down to config mode. In config mode, you can tell the router how to behave. When you're done doing that, you can use the end command or press the Control-Z sequence to move back to enable mode. While moving between the modes may be relatively simple, it's hard to really understand what these modes are for until you see lots of examples. Before we do that though, let's consider the types of commands you would use in each mode. There's 2 main styles of commands. One's called exec commands and one's called configuration commands. As you see here in the table, they've got some differences. First of all, exec commands are only used in user or enable mode, whereas configuration commands are only used in config mode. The main difference is the following. When you type an exec command, you expect iOS to give you some messages back. Typically these commands display information about what the router's doing, whereas config commands, you don't get any messages in return. However, exec commands typically do not tell the router how to behave. It doesn't tell it anything about how to route packets or what interfaces to use and that kind of thing. Whereas configuration commands can tell the router things like, do use this interface, don't use that one, use a particular IP address, use a particular routing protocol. So these configuration commands change the configuration or behavior of the router or switch. As you go through your CCNA studies, you'll see lots and lots of exec and configuration commands. This table shows 3 different commands that we'll use at step 2. In particular, there's the show IP route command, and that's an exec command that's available both in user mode and enable mode. It's available in user mode because it cannot harm the operation of the router. We'll also look at the reload command, which is only available in enable mode. It's an exec command, but because it can harm the operation of the router because it can cause the router to reboot, it's only available in enable mode. Finally, we'll look at the hostname configuration command, which changes the router's configuration. So let's begin in user mode at the command line interface. Notice the prompt has a greater than sign reminding me I'm in user mode. Now if I type the enable command and press enter, notice the router gives me a password prompt. Here's where I type in the enable password. Note of course it does not show the actual text of the password when you're typing, so nobody can look over your shoulder. And press enter. Now you're in enable mode. I know I'm in enable mode because I've got a pound sign at the end of the prompt. Now if you're tired of that, you can just use the disable command as shown here. Press enter. And now you're back to user mode. Next, take a look at the show IP route command. From user mode, it's accepted. The show IP route command can't hurt the router, so user mode is an appropriate place for that command. However, if we type the reload command, notice we get these messages. In fact, if you look closely, you can see this phrase that says unknown command. That's the important part of this message. That's the router saying, hey, I don't know what the reload command is. Now, technically that's not true. What the router's really saying is, if you're in user mode, I'm going to act like I don't know what that command is because that command is not a valid user mode exec command. Now, if I move back to enable mode with the enable command and enable password, and now I try the reload command, notice the router reacts differently. In this case, it gives me a quick question saying, you sure you want to do this? Saying proceed with reload, and the answer in brackets is confirm. If I press enter key right now, it's going to reload the router. As it turns out, I don't want to do that for our purposes here in lab. So if you just type in for no and press enter, the router believes that you don't want to reload the router and gives you a command prompt. Next, let's take a look at how to move to configuration mode. We're beginning here in enable mode, so by typing the configure terminal command as you see here, you move into configuration mode. Now notice the command prompt changed. The word config is in parentheses before the pound sign, and that's a reminder that you're in configuration mode. Now just as a proof, we'll try the show IP route command that you see there, and press enter, and it tells you it doesn't know what that command is. Also, if we try the reload command, it's also not recognized because those are exec commands as opposed to being configuration commands. Now if we try a valid configuration command like the hostname command, let's try hostname Fred and press enter. Note that the hostname immediately changes to Fred and the command actually is accepted. For instance, look at the command prompt. The command prompt always begins with the host name of the device, and as soon as we press the enter key after the hostname Fred command, the router went ahead and reacted. So that's a nice reminder that when a router is configured, the router actually uses that configuration just as soon as you type it in. Now when you're tired of configuration mode, you can use the end command or Control Z as I did there to get out of config mode. And if you want to see the actual configuration that's being used right now, you could use the show running config command as I've done here and see that output. In particular, if you look near the top, you'll see the hostname Fred command that we just configured. Well, that concludes lab number 1. In this lab, you've seen how to use the iOS command line interface help features. You've heard a description of the differences between user, enable, and configuration modes, as well as between exec commands and configuration commands. You've also seen the commands that allow you to move between user mode, enable mode, and configuration mode.
Hello and welcome to ICND1 Lab 2, Router Configuration and Managing Configuration Files. For those of you using the Cisco Press exam certification guides, this lab demonstrates some of the key concepts shown in the ICND1 books, Chapter 13.
This lab has 3 main objectives. The first 2 relate to the configuration process. So by the time you're done with this lab, you should be able to describe the configuration process and how configuration mode uses several configuration submodes. You'll also be able to recognize several of the different configuration submodes based on the command prompts that identify those modes. The third objective relates to the copy command. We'll talk about how to use the copy command to copy different configuration files inside a router and how to see the contents of those configuration files. The scenario for Lab 2 uses 2 basic steps. In the first step, you'll see a guided tour of how to get into configuration mode, navigate around different configuration modes, and recognize the prompts in those different configuration modes. In the second step, you'll see how to view and copy configuration files between RAM, NVRAM, and TFTP. Lab number 2 uses the exact same lab topology as lab number 1. In this case, we've got 3 routers and several switches, but we're just going to be using router 1 in this case. We'll have a PC connected via a console cable to router 1, and we'll use a terminal emulator on the PC to access the console and configure the router. So let's begin step 1 of CVM Lab 2. This step covers the configuration process, so before seeing the command line interface of how to get into configuration mode, let's review a few concepts. First of all, to reach configuration mode, the user must access user mode from either the console, auxiliary port, or using Telnet. Then use the enable command to reach enable or privilege mode. Then use the configure command to reach configuration mode. At this point, the user is in configuration mode and can type configuration commands that configure the router or switch. When the user is tired of that, they can use the end or exit command to exit configuration mode, or just press Control Z.
Configuration mode is separated into several different submodes.
For instance, here you see listed the submode called Interface Mode, and you use Interface submode to configure details about a particular interface. For instance, that interface's IP address. Now, the best way to understand and better appreciate configuration submodes is to see it from the command line interface. However, just for reference, note there the line and router submodes that you may see in some of the other labs. So let's take a look at the command line interface. We're starting out on router R1 in user mode. So to get to enable mode, we simply use the enable command, press enter, and we're in enable mode. This router does not have anything configured at all except the host name of R1, so there's no enable password or enable secret password configured. Now to get into configuration mode, you use the configure space terminal command as you see there. Press enter, and now you're in configuration mode. Now you know you're in config mode first of all because the configure terminal command puts you into global configuration mode. Also notice the command prompt has the word config in parentheses now. This is indicative of being in global configuration mode. Now to see some of the global configuration commands that you can use here, you could just press the question mark, and as usual you can hit the space bar to see lots more lines or the enter key to see a few more lines. And if you hit the space bar a few times, you'll notice down here near the bottom you see the host name command. Hostname command is the command used to define the router's own host name. If you page down a little bit more, you'll see the interface command. So we'll take a look at these two commands. So if I press any key to stop the output, and then I say use the hostname command. Notice I type hostname and say in this case, let's give it hostname Fred. As soon as I press the enter key after the command, the router accepts the command and starts using it. For instance, notice the command prompt has changed from R1 to Fred at the beginning. That's just a reminder that the router immediately uses the command as soon as you type the enter key. So that's one example of a global configuration command. Next, let's look at the interface command. By typing the command interface serial 0/1/0 and pressing enter, we've told the router configuration mode that we'd like to go into interface config mode for that particular interface. Notice the command prompt has changed. Instead of just config, it shows config-if, if meaning interface. So we're in a different configuration mode. If I use the question mark here, I get a totally different set of commands available. If you compare this list to the list that you saw a little bit earlier in global config mode, notice you don't see some of the commands. For instance, here in the commands that start with H, the hostname command is not listed. That's because in interface configuration mode, only interface appropriate commands are available. Now you do see the command IP there. There are a lot of IP configuration details you might configure under an interface. For instance, you might want to configure the IP address of the interface. So here we'll use the IP address command, IP space address, then the IP address, and then the subnet mask. And if we press enter, we've just assigned an IP address to that interface. There are several other configuration submodes as well. For instance, to configure the console, you could use the line con0 command, press enter. Notice the command prompt has changed to be config-line toward the end of it. That line refers to the console line, and now you can configure details about the console. Note also that the line con0 command moved us directly from interface configuration mode to line configuration mode. iOS configuration mode accepts any global configuration command from any mode and does what that command says. In this case, the line con0 global configuration command moved us directly to line configuration mode. Next, if we use the question mark, we see a totally different set of commands here as compared with interface configuration mode. For instance, at the console, it's common to want to configure a password, so you could type the login command and then the password command. These two commands together tell the router to require a password at the console. That's what the login command does. And the password command tells the router what password to expect from a user of the console. Once you're done configuring a router in config mode, you can exit configuration mode. You can use the end command or the Control-Z command to immediately go back to enable mode, or you can use the exit command, which backs you up one level at a time. Notice there I used the exit command and I went from line configuration mode back to global config mode. If I type the exit command again, it would move me all the way back to enable mode. Next, let's move on to step 2. When you type in configuration commands in any of the configuration modes, the router puts those commands into RAM memory into a file called the running-config file.
Essentially, the running-config file holds all the configuration parameters used by a router when it's up and working. Now there's another config file in the router in non-volatile RAM, and that file is called the startup-config file. RAM memory loses its contents when a router loses power, so NVRAM is a place where the router can store its configuration commands so that when the router loses power, powers back up, he's got a valid and useful configuration. Now consider the configuration process for a moment. When you go into config mode, you add configuration commands and they change the running config file. However, you want to be ready for the next time the router reboots by having those commands in the startup config file. So to do that, you simply use the copy command. Here we see the command copy space running-config space startup-config, which can be abbreviated copy space run space start, and that copies the running config over into the startup configuration file and replaces the old startup configuration file. So that's something you would normally do. Now another command that you might find useful, but probably not nearly as often, is the copy startup config running config command. Now this command copies the startup configuration file over into RAM. However, in some cases that copy does not replace the running config, it only adds to the configuration in running config. So you have to be a little bit careful about using the command. But under normal operations, it's pretty common to both configure the router, then use the copy space run space start command to copy the running config file over to the startup configuration file. It's also a good practice to keep a copy of your configurations outside the router and switch. So you could use a TFTP server as shown here and copy the running config from the router over to the server, or copy the startup config from NVRAM over to the server. Then later, if you ever have a problem with the router and want to restore an old configuration, you can use the copy command that has the TFTP option first. For instance, copy TFTP running-config, which copies the configuration file from the server back into the router. So let's go back to the command line interface and look at the contents of the running config and startup config files. By using the show space running-config command and pressing enter, you see the contents of the running config file. Notice near the top we see the hostname Fred command. That's where we change the hostname from R1 to Fred. If you hit the spacebar 2-3 more times, you'll get down to where we see interface serial 010. Notice we have the IP address 1.1.1.1 command that we had configured earlier. And then finally, if you space further down toward the bottom, you see the line console 0 command with the password Cisco and login commands that we had configured earlier. You may have noticed that the output of the show running config command includes a lot of configuration commands that you haven't seen yet or we haven't talked about in the video. iOS includes many default configuration commands in the output. However, we'll stay focused on a short list of commands for this video. Now if you do the show startup config command, as you see here, notice the host name lists R1 instead of Fred. Hit the spacebar a few times, notice there is no IP address configured on serial 010 right now. And going further down under line console 0, notice there's no login command or no password command. So indeed, after configuring things in configuration mode, the running config file was updated, but the startup config file was not automatically updated. Now if you want to save the configuration that's in the running config file into the startup-config file so it's used the next time the router boots, you need to use the copy space running-config space startup-config command that you see there on the screen. When you press enter, you get a prompt question that says, well, do you want to copy this to the startup config file? And of course we do, so you just press the enter key. It tells us it's building the config, and there you go, you've copied the file. So now, if we were to do a show startup config command again, as you see here, notice the host name Fred is listed there in the startup config, where it wasn't before we did the copy command. If you page down a little, under interface serial 010, you see the IP address, and down at the bottom under line console 0, of course, the password and login commands have been copied there as well. At this point, the running configuration file and the startup configuration file should be identical. This concludes lab number 2. In this lab, you've learned how to describe the configuration process and how it uses different configuration modes. You've also seen the different command prompts that identify several of the more popular different configuration submodes. and you've seen how to use the show and copy command, in particular how to use the copy command to copy the running configuration file and the startup configuration file.